Um, I want to welcome everyone to the 11th meeting of the 46th year of the Rotary Club of Dublin and Worthington. Today's invocation and Pledge of Allegiance will be provided by Bob Hanson. And so Bob,
We don't see him.
please go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to read a prayer written by Cameron Bellum. I thought would be appropriate for this time. Prayer for a pandemic. May we who are merely inconvenienced remember those whose lives are at stake. May we who have no risk factors remember those most vulnerable. May those who have the luxury of working from home remember those who must choose between preserving their health or making their rent. May those who have the flexibility to care for our children when schools close remember those who have no options. May we who have to cancel a trip remember those who have no safe place to go. May we who are losing our margin money in the tumult of the economic market remember those who have no margin at all. May those who settle for quarantine at home remember those who have no home. As fear grips our country, let us choose love during this time when we cannot physically wrap our arms around each other. Let us find ways to be the loving embrace to God and our neighbor. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the
United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Bob. President-elect Steve, will you introduce any visiting Rotarians or guests that may be present for this meeting?
Yes. Looking down the list, I do not see any guests this week. We do have our speaker, Ken. Thanks for being here, but we'll introduce him better later. So right now, I'm looking for happy dollars. Who's got one? Just shout it out. I'll go first. So I decided that I'm going to start getting up at 5:30 in the morning and start going to bed at 10:30. And so far this week, I'm 3 for 3. So, you know, it's progress. I'm happy.
Good. I've got a happy dollar. Can you
Go
hear
for
me?
it. Yeah, go for it, Roger.
My grandson, Jennifer's son, was just named president of his class at Columbus Academy through his senior year.
Wow. Congrats. That's awesome. Who else has a happy dollar?
I do. It's Teresa. Although I'm driving with no contact, so I can't put on video.
Go for it.
My daughter, in one of her classes, they were divided up into threes, and in their discussion, she noticed a boy sitting by himself, and she turned and included him in the conversation. And her teacher happened to catch her doing that, and ended up, she is student of the month out of all of her sophomore class at Liberty, which is about 650 kids.
Wow. That's pretty nice.
Proud mama.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you must be proud. How could you not? That's awesome.
Good training, Teresa.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I guess
Anybody else?
I'll give $1 today because I can.
That's a great reason. And Jerry, I bet you could give $1 tomorrow and the day after as well. So just keep them coming, you know, just send them to Jennifer. All right.
I don't have anything to say. I just want to
I think that's it. Back to you, Jim.
Okay. We're looking for announcements, and I'm sure Alan has an announcement regarding a major event.
We do have a major event, everybody. Remember that World Polio Day is on Saturday, October 24th, and in celebration thereof, we are having Pours for Polio. And we invite you to either join us virtually, which would be fantastic, and on October 20th from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m., either virtually or in person, if you care to, at the Rusty Bucket in Hills Market Plaza. We're asking a donation of $25 each, and hopefully we'll surpass our fundraising for Polio Plus from last year. So if you have questions of that, please feel free to give me a call.
And I will say on top of that, so far we have, I believe, 9 people registered between in-person and Zoom, and we've already raised $150. So we still have quite a ways to go. So I will be sending out another kind of announcement just to get to the top of everybody's inbox, but please sign up if you intend to.
And of course, you're welcome to make a donation to Polio Plus, whether or not you're going to pour for polio. And if you're already donating to the foundation and you add $25 to Polio Plus, that's where the magic number came from, in case you're wondering. You'll then be a member of the 125 Club. Thanks, everybody, for your support of this amazing cause. We're down to 2 countries in the world that have polio. We just recently eradicated Nigeria. So Nigeria is now, and all of Africa is now polio free. Just Pakistan and Afghanistan is all that's left. We're actually trying to raise $750 million, and they think that that will make that gone in the next 5 years, having been set back a little bit by COVID.
Given that our activities are as a club are limited, it is important that we really get behind our fundraising, and this is one of our major fundraisers for the year. So please do, even if you cannot attend, please donate to the cause, and hopefully we will get also some folks who join us via Zoom and or in person. It's one of the few opportunities that we've been able to structure so that you can join us in person. Thank you. Any other announcements? Jerry, do you want to at least give us a highlight on the resource pantries?
You'll be getting more information, but we're putting together a Rotary food drive, if you will, for the pantries in Worthington and Dublin by collecting food on the 24th of October. So you can at least get ready, put it on your calendar. You'll be getting an email to sign up to volunteer to be part of it. Be 9 o'clock to 11:30, since the TV gods decided that Ohio State should play at noon. So we'll collect food till 11:30 and help feed our neighbors. Films at 11, as they say.
Okay. Any other announcements? Okay. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a fellow social worker, Dr. Kenneth R. Yeager. Ken is a professor in the College of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, and is the director of the STAR program. It should be noted that a social worker is ending up head of a major department in psychiatric facility, a major psychiatric facility, and he's probably one, if not the only, doctor in that position, doctor of social work. He is an endowed professorship at the David E. Schuler Professor for Patient Compassion. As I mentioned, he is the director of the Stress, Trauma, and Resilience program there, which addresses trauma and victims of violence, along with other types of trauma that go on with individuals. He has written numerous books on the resiliency of building, treating, and comorbid substance abuse, including his textbook, Evidence-Based Practice Manual, Research and Outcome Measures in Health and Human Services. He is also a treating clinician for the National Football League program for substance abuse. He's married with 2 children and 1 grandchildren, and one of his most interesting hobbies is the restoration of his 1809 home. I have gotten acquainted with Ken and was pleased that we shared quite a few individuals that we knew in the profession, and I was able to hear him earlier in the year, and he has an excellent presentation this morning on dealing with anxiety, depression, and other trauma during COVID. So take it away.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate the kind introduction. And Steve, thank you for connecting me online. I'm going to share my slides.
Okay.
And get to the beginning of them with any luck here. I think we're there. So, good morning. I am Ken Yeager, and I am, as Jim indicated, a professor in the College of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. And my work is around creating compassionate care. So many of you have had family members come through the medical center, and I couldn't help but hearing with great sadness the case of another individual in your group who lost a family member, and that individual was in fact alone in an ICU. The Stress, Trauma, and Recovery program and Resilience program actually started working with people in the community, and then we transitioned to caring for healthcare providers to build resilience there. Then we started building compassionate care. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about stress, trauma, and resilience, and looking at the current mental health and wellness of the United States in really uncertain times. So just a couple of questions here. How often have you been bothered by feeling down or depressed in the past 5 months? Not at all? A few days, several days, or more often than not? And then a very similar question poses, how often have you been bothered by feeling anxious or fearful in the past 5 months? Not at all, a few days, several days, or more often than not. And I don't need to hear any of your answers out loud. I just wanted to kind of pose these questions because we're going to circle around to a little bit of information related to this in just a minute. But the fact of the matter is we live in a difficult time. It is an election year, so you're seeing all of those wonderful election ads, and they're coming around. We have issues in the United States very similar to the 1960s, where we've had inequality, racial discrimination, social injustice, all kinds of issues going on in our society. All of this during a time when we are being deluged by a tidal wave of information and data, and many are finding themselves swimming in a sea of facts without ever finding the truth. We are in the midst of an economic downturn, high levels of unemployment, high levels of uninsured individuals, high levels of childhood hunger as children are not connected with their schools. And finally, and obviously, the pandemic and what it looks like in an emergency setting in an intensive care unit. So this is actually an ICU picture from the medical center. And as you can understand, this is a very high stressful time, especially for the care providers, many of whom I've supported throughout the past several months in their efforts to provide the care, in their efforts to support family members, in their efforts to keep their own family safe, and the fear of transmitting the virus to their family and children. It's not only the healthcare providers that are having issues. Actually, the coronavirus pandemic is pushing America into a mental health crisis. What is our current reality? Well, we are living in an unprecedented time of stress and uncertainty, and situations that we used to seem to take for granted are somehow changed, different, and unfamiliar. And in general, society seems to be much less civil around many issues where there's this polarization going on. And one of the things that I want to get across today is understanding and being aware of what are potential triggers for you, and to touch briefly on a concept called the just world belief. And many of us were taught this through our upbringing, from our parents, from our teachers, from our churches, that if we work hard and do good things will come to us. And we live our life with that belief system, and it works well until you find yourself in a situation where there's challenging information coming in. And we see wonderfully productive, kind, beautiful people who are dying at a rate of about 3,500 a day. And we have surpassed now more deaths in combination of World War I, Korea, Vietnam, and the first Iraq war combined. So we're around 210,000. That will challenge your just world belief. And then we're in a world where there's this stigmatized view of mental health. I remember my parents talking about cancer in hushed voices because it was a death sentence when I was a child. And they also spoke of mental illness. I clearly remember at about age 10, my father in a hushed voice saying to my mother, he has manic depressive disorder. And it was like it was something horrible, which in fact, it is a difficult disease, but it is treatable. So with the questions we just asked, the National Center for Health Statistics partnered with the Census Bureau on an experimental data system called the Household Pulse Survey. And in this survey, it was a randomized national survey where individuals were asked the two questions that I asked you previously. The only difference is the question asked in the past 2 weeks related to the diagnostic criteria for depression and anxiety. Interestingly enough, for every 100 American adults, 34 show symptoms of anxiety, depression, or both. So when you think about this on a level playing field, about 4 show symptoms of depression alone, and about 10 show symptoms of anxiety alone. But then 20 show symptoms of both anxiety and depression. And how does that manifest? It manifests in the world seeming like a much less safe place. So when you start figuring this out and calculating across time, in 2013 and 14, the numbers were much lower. You're seeing a rate of 17%. But during the pandemic, 50% experienced a depressed mood. And when we're looking at the situation, it's a doubling across the board between anxiety, depression, and the combination of two. So we are approaching this in a situation where we have now a mental health pandemic. And the issue being, when you have this many of the population experiencing anxiety and depression, what is the impact? Well, one of the things we know is that the impact is not evenly distributed. We're pretty fortunate in Ohio to be at about a third, indicating this. Mississippi is probably much less prepared, with nearly half of the adults in Mississippi showing symptoms of anxiety or depression. 40% in New Jersey, 40% in New Mexico, and then the lower areas are Kansas and North Carolina. And what we are beginning to see are areas where those are beginning to pick up a little more. North Carolina is beginning to pick up a little more now. So if you've been feeling like the world is a less safe place, and you're beginning to feel like you're having some anxious times, it's an important thing to understand that you're not alone. There are many in the United States having the very same experiences. So what do we know? Well, vicarious trauma is defined as those not immediately involved or traumatized can eventually be traumatized by what they hear and what they see, even if they are not present. And to give you an example, how many of you still look up when you hear a jet flying over low and loud and it catches your attention? This is a relic of 9/11. So it lives at a preconscious level until you're reminded of this through an environmental trigger. Traumatic stress is elevated levels of stress that are experienced with engagement of activities that could or might bring about a negative impact. So the idea of going to the grocery store was never anything that was challenging to Americans until COVID. And then going to the grocery store brought about great levels of anxiety. What do we clean up? What do we do? How do we clean the food before we eat it? What do we do? And then there's moral distress. And moral distress is different from ethical challenges. Moral distress occurs when there are multiple appropriate actions, but there's really not an agreement on what is the best practice, which again is something we're seeing around the pandemic and the belief systems that have polarized the United States. So an understandable response to uncertainty or the trauma is to be hypervigilant. When you're bringing the groceries into the house, you're cleaning off the groceries, you're taking the sacks out. When you're coming home from work at the hospital, in my case, I come into the house having derobed in the garage, which, you know, with the garage door down, that's not that big a deal. Running through the house in my boxers upstairs so I can shower, so I'm not bringing this into the home. So that's a form of hypervigilance. Donning PPE as I walk around the medical center with my medical students, teaching them how to interact with these families. So hypervigilance is frequently followed by avoidance. If you can, you try to avoid the situations that cause the anxiety. And many of us have figured out now how to order our groceries online so we don't meet that situation. And if you can't avoid it, you try to control it. So controlling it brings about methods of, I've got to keep this in line. And I think it's interesting, the parallel between this and teaching your children how to drive, because we all know what happens when you combine teenagers and cars. And we become overprotective of our teenagers. In the pandemic, we're becoming overprotective of our elders and taking care of our aging siblings and relatives. With all of this, if you're hypervigilant, you try to avoid situations, you try to control situations, there's an erosion of trust. Who or what do I trust? What's the right source? What information can I believe in? And what can I do with this information? And as trust begins to be challenged, intimacy is challenged. And by intimacy, I mean sharing your own thoughts, concerns with others, and asking, where are we going with this? It is painful to carry all of this information around. It is challenging. And it adds weight to your day that you don't really understand is there. It again is functioning at a preconscious level. But what does it manifest as? Fear, anxiety, sadness, feeling helpless and unsafe, which ties directly to that 33% of Ohioans who have experienced anxiety and depression. And do we need to still talk in hushed voices about anxiety or depression? I think not, because anyone, regardless of age, ethnicity, race, can develop a mental health condition. In fact, 1 in 5 adults, or approximately 4.3 million Americans, will experience a mental health condition in any given year. It's a large number. Many people say acts of violence towards others are a result of mental illness. The person couldn't be in their right mind if they did what they did. Well, when you look at this across time, an individual with mental health condition is 10 times more likely to be the target of a violent crime, opposed to the person without a mental health condition. And the perception of mental health varies across many ethnic and cultural backgrounds based on our experiences. So what are other contributors to stress and anxiety? We just finished at the University Department of Psychiatry a national study examining people's use of social media. And I'm going to throw out a term that you may or may not have heard called doom scrolling, where people get on and start reading all the bad situations and everything. And what we're beginning to understand is doom scrolling, news watching are strongly correlated, not causal, but correlated to anxiety and depression, where people begin to compare themselves to others, where they begin to read the stories that are posted or the posts that are posted, and understanding that, or maybe not understanding that they're only posting the very good or the very best things. Social media is a double-edged sword. They can lead you down or it can lead you up. Social media is a great way to connect with others and to begin to understand that social distancing is not the same as social isolation. And the good news is you can control who you follow. You can ghost people so that they don't know that you're ghosting them or not following them. You can block a user by tapping their profile and using the 3-dot menu in the top right hand of the page and block them. So the answer becomes paying attention to your screen time. The world exists beyond the screen, and moderation is key in doing so. The other factor is many people don't understand that the internet gathers your preferences. So if you sign on under your username in your VPN, people will understand that the internet is collecting all this data on you and it's feeding you information based on where you have been previously. It's interesting if you log in anonymously, what the change in the news feeds are, what the change in the advertisements are, what the change in the way that people use data today leads to if you're not under your name. So the future is teaching us a lot in health and research, and we're beginning to understand mental illness as a chronic brain disease. It is a disorder that is certainly molded by biopsychosocial factors, and it does have devastating consequences to individuals and to society. Depression is the most expensive disease to treat across the world. The World Health Organization for the last 30 years has documented depression is the most expensive disorder to our society. So we are making progress in genetics and neuroscience research, and we're developing new technologies and using tools that were not previously used. We are doing clinical trials with drugs that are differently thought of. For example, we're using low doses of LSD or hallucinogenic drugs to be able to treat trauma in victims by giving a low dose and processing their experiences. And the LSD, or the lysergic diethylamide acid, is actually leading to a different processing in the brain, and it seems to be mitigating the impact of those traumas. And we know this because we now have brain imaging devices to assess brain function and neurochemistry in humans. Many of you might experience that anxiety, and I'm guessing you would never say, I'm a little anxious today because I have less norepinephrine in my system. We really don't say that. We almost always attribute it to our environment. So understanding these processes through biological and socio-cultural factors help us to build resilience. And really, what we are working on doing is building a Framingham-like study. So back from the 60s, Framingham study looked at heart disease and factors associated with this. We're doing the same thing at Ohio State, looking at the neurocircuitry of the brain. We're looking at how to mediate and reward and motivate people, and how to build higher levels of executive control, and understanding the brain development role. And why is it those teenagers who are learning to drive at 15 and a half, why do they make the decisions they make that oftentimes puts them at risk? And the answer becomes is because executive functioning doesn't fully come online until about age 25. Now, young women understand the nuances of this quicker than young men. And the reason being is young men really have a different way of processing issues, where the young ladies understand if I tell one person something, it's going to go through the entire group. Young men don't care about that. So the young ladies begin to develop this around 10, 13, and the primary processing thinking in young men occurs at about 43, 44. So we've got a little bit of a gap here. So in closing, I want to talk a little bit about resilience. How do you get to resilience? Well, the negative screams at you and the positive only whispers. So we want you to think about identifying 3 of the positive things that you see a day to counteract the negatives that you see. This blooming flower, the picture was taken January 22nd, 2017 at the house that I had while I was beginning to restore the 1809 home. And here's this flower. It was 23 degrees the night before. The next day it's in the low 50s, and this flower, where the plant around it is dying and decaying, decided to bloom. You see, resilience is everywhere. You just have to find it. And it requires us avoiding a path of negativism, always trying to stay to the positive. And it's seeking alternative responses to adversity. It requires you to work against biological forces that actually lead to survival by identifying the risk. But if you start looking for the positive, it'll change the way you think about yourselves in the world. This is a 30-foot, maybe a 50-foot tree growing out of the bottom of Bryce Canyon, out of a rock crevice of about 6 inches. Nobody told that tree it couldn't be resilient. So what does resilience do for you? It helps us to understand that we can progress. We can move forward through the pain we're experiencing. We can pursue a purpose larger than ourselves to reach out to others in supportive ways while maintaining respect and kindness in all that you do. And we find over time, we've become wiser, kinder, more thoughtful, helpful, and thankful for the choices that we have that has made us the individuals that we are today. So looking for 3 good things each day, reflecting on what you did well today, and understand how you talk to yourself is very important, because many of us speak with ourselves more harshly than we do with others. Understand that difficult work is difficult work. It's not part of your functioning. And monitor for burning out, because we have this big issue of burnout in COVID and COVID brain coming about. Emotionally exhausted. Can you recharge your batteries in the time you have off? Depersonalization is the difficulty in connecting with others. Back to that slide where we talked about intimacy, and a reduced sense of accomplishment or decreased confidence and satisfaction. Monitor those, because if they're creeping up, you're having some difficulty. So what is the evidence? So a brilliant friend of mine, Taya Singer, is at the Max Planck Institute. And Taya designed a research study in which she brought 16 Tibetan monks to her lab because they can go to emotional states at will. And she asked the monks to go to a state of empathy, using her functional MRIs to measure brainwave indication. All of the pathways of pain lit up. So Singer thought maybe it's sympathy that gives reward. And again, in the fMRIs of those 16 monks, pain developed. And the monk said to Singer, please allow us to experience compassion. And one by one, as they went into the fMRI, the action reward system of the brain, the dopamine cascade reward system, lit up. And Singer was just amazed. What happened? And the monks explained to Singer, it is not until you understand the individual's pain and you understand as if that pain is yours, are you able to engage in a simple act of kindness that leads to compassion. A simple act of kindness. All we really need to do every day of our lives to reward ourselves is to be kind to somebody. This is hard science, ladies and gentlemen. This is cutting edge technology being applied to understanding how to build compassion. We experience the pain and loss of those who have died from COVID. We have sympathy for the family members who are unable to be with them at the time. And we will understand and live in their pain until we engage in a simple act of kindness, which then rewards us and helps the other individual feel better as well. So the take-home message today is find and engage in as many simple acts of kindness that you can each day to build your levels of compassion as well as your individual levels of resilience. And I will stop there because I'm about 4 minutes over what I was supposed to speak, and I will go back to Jim. By the way, if people need help, it's the National Suicide Prevention Line, the Crisis Text Line, it's free support, and the STAR program at OSU. It was a hard number to come up with, 614-293-STAR. I don't know where we came up with that, or 7827. And I will stop sharing and we will go back to Jim.
Yes, certainly there are a lot of, you've presented a lot of things here that people can respond to. So I want to open it up for questions or comments. Certainly the main purpose of this organization assists with building compassion because it's service above self. So I noted that in the presentation, that the more we serve, the greater compassion will develop. It's not a matter of looking at people and saying we have sympathy, but more taking action in simple acts of kindness. Any questions, comments, thoughts?
It's Teresa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just put in the chat a request for the last section of slides, if you're able.
I am happy to share that. Steve or Jim, if you can send me your email, I'm happy to share my slides.
Thank you.
Expanded slide deck with more tips for resilience. So I'm happy to share with you.
Thank you.
Other things that folks thought of or triggered thoughts about what's going on. It's certainly for me, there were a couple places that I began to recognize some of the things that especially in the area of isolation, recognize we're contributing.
It was really an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it was a very timely topic, and I like the delivery of it. I like the way you rounded it out with some hope for solutions, and this was really enjoyable.
Thank you very much, Teresa.
And you obviously were very successful because everybody is trying to make you feel like we're being kind to you.
I love it. And you're all benefiting from it. So yeah, Jerry, you hit the nail on the head.
Ken, I'm just sitting here, digesting everything you said because there's a lot of great information. And I'm kind of wondering, and I apologize if I missed it, like after COVID, how do we get out of this as a society? Like is there some future that we can look forward to where it's like, okay, well, if COVID goes away, maybe we will naturally become less fearful, less anxious as a society? I know it's not a very good question, but maybe you could speak to it a little.
Well, it's actually a very good question because that's what people are thinking about right now. In general, healthcare has been based on negativity. When we do assessments of individuals, we look for negative symptoms. Symptoms that are decreased energy, decreased happiness, decreased, whatever, stamina. And we're looking at blood work and we're looking for the out of control blood markers. Part of what I think we need to do as a nation is start looking at strengths and utilizing a strengths perspective and balancing the strengths against the negatives and understanding that it's as much in how we approach mental health and mental wellness as it is what we see symptom-wise. And one of the things that is a very subtle shift is instead of saying, why does that person act that way? Take into consideration what they've experienced through their lives and ask the question, I wonder what's happened to them that is leading them to behave the way they are. Because our actions are always in response to our experiences. And if we begin to look at this as a reaction rather than a negative, we can better understand one another.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ken, what do you think the long-term impact will be on our children as they deal with this and as they develop as adults?
That's a really good question. We just had our first grandchild in January of 2020. And we were sitting outside visiting my son and his wife and little Izzy. And his wife asked, she hoped that Izzy didn't come. Was there ever a time where we didn't have to wear masks, Daddy? And it's interesting about the impact on individuals. When the individual is surrounded by the negativity, they begin to view the world as more negative. When individuals are challenged in their life, they begin to develop responses that oftentimes aren't coping in a way that's positive, but it's negative coping. And one of the things that's important to understand with children is helping them to process what they see in the world. So conversation is a very powerful tool with your kids. We know that having dinner with your children every night mitigates the risk of substance abuse. Communication is an incredibly powerful tool, and nurturing individuals as they are growing will help them to function at a higher rate until they get to the point where that executive functioning comes on board naturally. I think the breakdown of civility in the country has been coming for a very long time, maybe decades, but it's being driven by this division and the narrowing of news outlets. When in the 1970s, we probably had close to 50, 60 different news outlets in Ohio. Now we're down to 3 when you think about it. And those 3 are pushing their methods, and people only go to the sources that feels best for their schema. And what ends up happening is it keeps reassuring the negative and the negative and the negative. And what we really need to be doing is spending a lot less time on screen and a lot more time in activities that we can then have positive outcomes out of. Just like your Rotary meetings. Service above self is so important. And I think that's something that people can build and can incorporate into their lives so they have greater meaning in their lives. It's a long answer, John. I hope I got to the point for you.
I wanted to share something. My daughter's a psychiatrist, and she's associated with Dartmouth. And she said that when the pandemic started and the patients could not get out to maybe get their meds or even come for a session in Telmed, they became very sick. And she said that it's really, now they're coming back, and it's really been a challenge to get them on the right path again, and that they're very busy. And I was also thinking about random acts of kindness. So one thing I've been doing is I send an email to a Rotary friend who I've been missing. And an example is like Brian Elder. He's a young Rotarian I used to work with. And when school started and his wife's a teacher, I sent him an email and told him that I missed seeing him and that I wished his wife well as she started school, things like that. Little things that you can do, and to call someone, call your mother, and call friend, because seniors are really isolated and they really do need to talk to someone, just to say. And the one lady I called in the neighborhood, she said, "I'm just so glad to hear your voice," and I was glad to hear hers. So that's my little spiel.
I love it. I love it. Social isolation does not equal social distance.
Right, right.
And you're absolutely right, Shirley. Reaching out to people is good for both of them. You're reaching out to someone who needs to hear a friendly voice, and it's good for you to hear from them to assure yourself that they're okay. And you're absolutely on spot with the progression of illness in those with mental health challenges, because they are unable to get their medications, because they are having difficulty getting to sessions and traveling. And it is really challenging today.
Other comments or thoughts? Again, I think your presentation was excellent, Ken. I think it was quite stimulating for folks. Yeah.
Very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to meet you all and to participate in your meeting this morning.
So if there aren't any other questions, we'll move on to the remainder of the meeting. Next week's speaker is Lennon Sweeney, and she will be speaking on the making of metropolitan inequality, segregation of our metropolitan regions due to policies. And her speech will be directed towards policies both in Dublin and in Worthington that have assisted in our segregation and inequity in both of those communities. So I'm looking forward, and I hope you are, to her presentation next week. And with that, let's close with our four-way test. And for those, after we close the meeting, for those that want to stick around a while and either socialize or ask Dr. Yeager any additional questions, please do so. With the four-way test, and I'd like everyone to try to unmute themselves, and we'll try to stay together today. The four-way test of the things we think, say, and do. One, is it
the truth?
Truth.
Two,
Is it fair to all concerned?
Concerned.
three,
Will it build goodwill and better friendships?
four,
Will it be beneficial
Go to all
concerned?
concerned.
So today's presentation was quite applicable to those. So thank you very much. And we will move on to kind of more of an informal and allow those that have other things that they need to address or get to. See you next week and have a good week.
I'm
Have a
impressed
good week,
with-
everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.